At its peak, River Monsters felt untouchable. Strong rating, a loyal audience, and a host people trusted completely. So when the show quietly ended in 2017, the explanation never quite added up. No farewell, no final hunt, just silence. Years later, pieces of the truth began to surface, and they paint a much heavier picture than fans were ever told. Subscribe now if you want the full story, because the real reason River Monsters ended isn't about running out of monsters. It's about what Jeremy Wade saw happening to the rivers themselves. Long before River Monsters ever appeared on television, Jeremy Wade was already living the life the show would later document. He wasn't a presenter searching for a concept or a personality shaped by a network. He was a trained biologist and secondary school teacher who spent nearly every spare moment traveling to remote rivers across the world. For almost 2 decades, Wade funded his own expeditions, often traveling alone, carrying minimal gear, and relying entirely on local knowledge to survive and navigate unfamiliar waters. These early journeys weren't polished or predictable. Wade moved through regions most outsiders never reached, listening carefully to fishermen and villagers who had lived alongside the same rivers for generations. When people described unexplained attacks, missing livestock, or massive fish that shouldn't exist, he didn't dismiss them as myths. He wrote everything down: names, locations, injuries, water conditions, seasonal patterns. Over time, those handwritten notes became an archive of recurring stories that shared unsettling similarities across continents. Wade approached these accounts like investigations, not legends. He asked whether real animals could explain the events, whether known species behaved differently under certain environmental pressures, and whether science simply hadn't caught up to what people living on these rivers already knew. This mindset shaped everything that followed. He wasn't chasing fear, he was chasing understanding. In 2007, that lifelong routine was interrupted when Wade contracted a severe case of malaria during one of his trips. The illness nearly killed him and forced him into a long recovery. Unable to travel, he began organizing years of notebooks and field notes. Patterns emerged, more reveals than ever before. Similar stories from different rivers, similar injuries, similar species blamed across cultures that had never interacted. That moment of stillness became the foundation for River Monsters. From the beginning, Wade was clear about what the show would not be. It wouldn't exaggerate danger. It wouldn't invent threats. It wouldn't turn animals into villains. Each episode would follow a strict logic: local testimony first, scientific reasoning second, and confrontation only if necessary. The goal was explanation, not conquest. That philosophy gave the show its unique tone: calm, restrained, and unsettling, precisely because it didn't shout. But it also gave Wade something else: perspective. By the time cameras followed him into the field, he already knew how many of these rivers used to look, and he already sensed that something important was changing beneath the surface. At its peak, River Monsters felt untouchable: strong ratings, a loyal audience, and a host people trusted completely. What set River Monsters apart wasn't the size of the fish or the danger of the locations, it was the way the story was told. At a time when adventure television was dominated by shouting, countdowns, and manufactured peril, Jeremy Wade did the opposite. He slowed everything down. He let silence linger. He allowed uncertainty to exist without rushing to fill it. Each episode followed a strict philosophy. The investigation always began with local testimony. Wade treated fishermen, villagers, and river guides as primary sources, not colorful background. Their stories weren't brushed off as superstition, nor were they accepted blindly. They were starting points. From there, Wade applied biology, ecology, and experience to test whether a real animal could plausibly explain what had happened. Only after exhausting those steps did the show move toward confrontation, and even then, capture was never guaranteed or required. That restraint mattered. Wade didn't frame animals as villains. He explained behavior in context. A fish wasn't evil for attacking someone. It was responding to territory, hunger, injury, or environmental pressure. This approach quietly educated viewers while keeping the mystery intact. Danger felt real because it wasn't exaggerated. When Wade showed caution, it wasn't acting, it was earned. The calm tone also built trust. Audiences believed Wade because he never tried to impress them. He admitted uncertainty. He acknowledged when evidence was inconclusive. Some episodes ended without a clear answer, and that honesty became part of the show's identity. Viewers weren't watching a performance. They were watching an investigation unfold in real time. Behind the scenes, that philosophy acted as a boundary. It protected the show from becoming sensational, but it also limited where it could go. There were lines Wade refused to cross. No staged encounters, no recycled fear, no invented threats to satisfy spectacle. The success of River Monsters depended entirely on that credibility. credibility. Without it, the entire premise collapsed. For years, the balance held. The stories were there. The rivers still supported mystery. But the same philosophy that made the show work would eventually make continuing impossible. Because once reality stopped cooperating, once the rivers could no longer support the truth, River Monsters had nowhere left to go without betraying everything it stood for. That philosophy gave the show its unique tone, calm, restrained, and unsettling precisely because it didn't shout, but it also gave Wade something else, perspective. By the time cameras followed him into the field, he already knew how many of these rivers used to look, and he already sensed that something important was changing beneath the surface. At its peak, River Monsters felt untouchable, strong ratings, a loyal audience, and a host people trusted completely. The moment River Monsters broke through as one of Animal Planet's most watched programs, the scale of the operation changed overnight. What had started as a carefully paced investigative series suddenly became a global production machine. Budgets increased, expectations rose, and the pressure to deliver season after season intensified in ways most viewers never saw. With success came expansion. Early seasons could be filmed in relatively contained windows, often over a few weeks. Later seasons stretched into months. The locations grew more remote and more dangerous, deep jungle rivers, politically unstable regions, extreme climates where a single mistake could turn fatal. Reaching some filming sites required days of travel before a single line was cast. Every delay meant money lost. Every injury meant production risk. For Jeremy Wade, the danger was never abstract. He faced repeated near-death experiences as the show pushed deeper into extreme environments. Severe malaria nearly killed him more than once. Massive fish struck him with enough force to cause lasting injuries. Encounters with electric eels carried the real risk of muscle lock and drowning. These weren't dramatic edits. They were occupational hazards that compounded with each expedition. The crew felt it too. Workdays stretched past 14 hours. Sleep came in fragments. Recovery time between shoots shrank as the show bounced rapidly between continents. Burnout followed quietly. Veteran crew members began stepping away, not publicly, but steadily. New team members had to learn under pressure, often in places with no margin for error. At the same time, the production itself became more expensive and fragile. International permits grew harder to secure. Insurance companies raised concerns. Political instability in certain regions forced last-minute changes. Some episodes reportedly cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and a single weather delay could derail weeks of planning. From the outside, River Monsters looked stronger than ever. Ratings remained solid. The format still worked, but behind the camera, the balance was shifting. The show was no longer just about finding answers in rivers. It was about sustaining a massive operation in environments that resisted control. And as the risks increased, another problem quietly emerged. One no amount of experience, budget, or planning could fix. The rivers themselves were beginning to change faster than the show could adapt. That philosophy gave the show its unique tone, calm, restrained, and unsettling precisely because it didn't shout, but it also gave Wade something else, perspective. By the time cameras followed him into the field, he already knew how many of these rivers used to look, and he already sensed that something important was changing beneath the surface. At its peak, River Monsters felt untouchable, strong ratings, a loyal audience, and a host people trusted completely. So when the show quietly ended in 2017, the explanation never quite added up. No farewell, no final hunt, just silence. Years later, pieces of the truth began to surface, and they paint a much heavier picture than fans were ever told. By the middle years of River Monsters, the toll of making the show had moved beyond danger on screen. What viewers experienced as quiet tension and controlled risk was built on exhaustion, injury, and constant uncertainty behind the camera. The calm tone never changed, but the cost of maintaining it grew heavier every season. For Jeremy Wade, the physical consequences accumulated. Severe malaria nearly killed him and left lasting effects that made future expeditions harder to recover from. Long hours in extreme heat and cold weakened the immune system. Impacts from large fish caused injuries that lingered well after filming wrapped. Each season demanded that his body absorb punishment with little time to fully heal before the next trip began. The crew carried their own burden. Remote shoots meant limited medical access, unreliable communication, and constant exposure to environmental hazards. During one expedition, a crew member was struck by lightning, suffering permanent injuries that shook the entire production. It wasn't an isolated scare. It was a reminder that nature didn't care about schedules, budgets, or experience. Every expedition carried risks no insurance policy could truly truly cover. Behind the scenes, fatigue became routine. 14-hour days were common. Sleep was inconsistent. Meals were rushed or missed entirely. Moving between continents left little time to decompress. Over time, experienced crew members quietly stepped away. Their departures weren't announced, but their absence was felt. New staff filled the gaps, learning under pressure in environments where mistakes had serious consequences. Production strain compounded everything. International filming required layers of permits, security planning, and local coordination. Political instability could shut down locations overnight. Weather delays erased weeks of preparation. Insurance oversight tightened as incidents mounted. Episodes grew more expensive while becoming harder to guarantee. From the outside, river monsters still looked effortless. The structure held, the danger felt controlled, but sustaining that illusion required a level of sacrifice that couldn't continue indefinitely. The show wasn't failing creatively. It was succeeding at a cost that kept rising, physically, mentally, and financially. And as that cost climbed, another truth became impossible to ignore. Even if the team could keep pushing themselves further, the rivers they depended on were no longer offering the same answers. The danger was still real, but the life within those waters was quietly slipping away. That philosophy gave the show its unique tone, calm, restrained, and unsettling precisely because it didn't shout, but it also gave Wade something else, perspective. By the time cameras followed him into the field, he already knew how many of these rivers used to look, and he already sensed that something important was changing beneath the surface. Jeremy Wade began noticing an absence that could not be explained by weather, luck, or technique. Wade started revisiting earlier locations privately, without crews or schedules, simply to look. Rivers he remembered clearly from years before no longer behaved the same way. Water that once ran clean had turned cloudy. Banks that supported fishing communities had been reshaped by construction. Dams altered flow patterns so completely that seasonal rhythms no longer made sense. In some places, stretches of river were quieter than they had any right to be. The most unsettling change wasn't visual, it was biological. Species that once anchored entire episodes were missing, not elusive, not temporarily absent, but gone. Local fishermen no longer spoke about certain fish with urgency or fear. They spoke about them in the past tense. Nets came up lighter. Stories that once described recent encounters now sounded like memories. This wasn't a creative problem. It was an ecological one. The show didn't revisit species because ideas were exhausted. It did so because the number of rivers capable of supporting massive freshwater animals was shrinking fast. Each season required traveling farther and pushing deeper into regions with less infrastructure and greater risk, just to find evidence that these creatures still existed at all. Importantly, Wade refused to manufacture danger. If an animal couldn't plausibly explain an incident, the episode ended without spectacle. That restraint preserved the show's credibility, but it also exposed a harsh truth. The world that made river monsters possible was disappearing in real time. Fans began noticing patterns without understanding the cause. Online, some accused the show of repetition. Others wondered if Wade was holding back. Very few considered the possibility that the monsters themselves were becoming harder to find because their environments were failing. For Wade, the realization cut deeper. Continuing the show honestly meant acknowledging loss, decline, and absence. Themes that didn't fit a format built on mystery and pursuit. The danger on screen remained real, but the greater threat was unfolding quietly beneath it. And once that became clear, the show faced a problem that experience, budget, and courage could not fix. The rivers were changing faster than television could keep up. Audience expectations didn't slow down just because ecosystems were failing. Viewers wanted bigger fish, higher stakes, and more extreme location. Networks wanted escalation, not reflection. But the rivers were offering fewer genuine encounters, not more. Delivering spectacle without lying meant traveling farther, staying longer, and pushing deeper into unstable environments where safety margins were already thin. Revisiting species and locations wasn't about creative recycling, it was about necessity. The number of rivers capable of sustaining large freshwater predators was shrinking, and the show had to follow what still existed. But repetition created a new problem. To some viewers, it looked like the series was circling instead of advancing. To Wade, it felt like documenting the last traces of something that was slipping away. The alternative was worse. The show could continue by shifting tone, exaggerating danger, framing absence as mystery, or leaning into fear without evidence. But that would betray the very reason people trusted the series. River Monsters worked because it respected truth, even when truth was uncomfortable or incomplete. That left the show stuck between two incompatible demands. Television required escalation. Reality demanded honesty. The more Wade tried to reconcile those forces, the clearer the outcome became. Continuing meant compromising one of them, and Wade had already chosen which side he wouldn't betray. By this point, the ending wasn't about ratings, budgets, or exhaustion. It was about integrity. The show could keep going, but only by becoming something it was never meant to be. And once that realization set in, the path forward quietly closed. From a business standpoint, the math was hard to ignore. Some episodes reportedly cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to produce. Every season required months of travel across multiple continents. As network strategy leaned towards safer, more controllable formats, shows like River Monsters came under heavier scrutiny. Success alone was no longer enough. Reliability mattered more. Behind the scene, the shift was noticeable. Proposals that once moved quickly began stalling. Budgets tightened. Filming plans faced new restrictions. Locations that carried higher risk became harder to approve. Insurance companies raised red flags based on past incidents, including medical emergencies and crew injuries. Each new season required more justification than the last. For Jeremy Wade, this created another layer of tension. The very elements that made the show authentic, real danger, real remoteness, real uncertainty, were now liabilities. Reducing risk meant reducing honesty. Shorter shoots, fewer locations, and safer waters would fundamentally change what the show was. The network wasn't hostile to River Monsters. It simply wasn't built for what the show demanded anymore. As priorities shifted, Wade saw the writing on the wall. Continuing would mean constant negotiation, compromise, and pressure to reshape the format into something more predictable and less truthful. Combined with the ecological decline he was already witnessing, the network shift clarified the situation. Even if the rivers had remained unchanged, the environment around the show no longer supported what it needed to be. By the time 2017 approached, the question was no longer whether River Monsters could continue. It was whether continuing would strip it of everything that made it honest in the first place. Publicly, Jeremy Wade gave a simple explanation. The list was finished. The subject matter was finite. That statement was true, but it wasn't complete. What Wade chose not to say at the time was that continuing the show no longer felt honest. Environmental collapse had become impossible to ignore. Rivers he had documented for decades were failing. Species were vanishing. Safety risks had escalated. Ethical concerns weighed heavier with every expedition. To keep the format alive would have required compromise, with truth, with safety, or with purpose. Wade chose to stop instead. That choice became clearer in what followed. Wade didn't leave television. He changed direction. Mighty Rivers and Dark Waters shifted the focus away from hunting monsters and toward exposing human impact on fragile ecosystems. The danger hadn't disappeared. It had simply changed. In hindsight, River Monsters reads less like entertainment and more like a record, a snapshot of rivers captured just before irreversible change. The show didn't end because curiosity ran out. It ended because honesty demanded a new conversation, and that may be the heaviest ending of all.